Welcome to The Edge. We have an interesting guest tonight, Aiden Delgrado. Aiden has got to be known in this community. He's made several presentations all over the community, the whole area from Tampa all the way down to, I guess, Fort Myers. Aiden's got a story to tell, and I do believe that it's a good one in many respects. It talks about the nature of what we put our troops through, what some of the effects are, and what some of our own feelings are about what people do when they're in service. And so, Aiden, I'd like to talk to you about a little bit about how you backgrounded in school and that sort of thing, where you first went to school, where you ended up, and just take us the chronology of how you got where you are.
Well, I grew up overseas. My father was a diplomat, so I'd spent the first 18 years of my life moving around between different countries. I spent about the first 7 years in Thailand, where I went to an international school, the next 4 in Senegal, where I went to another international school, and the final 7 years in Cairo, Egypt, where I attended Cairo American College. And
so
that's
you
sort
were
of,
how old when you were in Cairo?
I was between maybe 11 and 18. And after I left Cairo, I came to the United States to attend college at the New College of Florida here in Sarasota.
And you're still at New College?
No, actually, I just graduated last year with a degree in religion.
Okay. Now, what languages did you learn when you were traveling?
Well, initially when I was overseas, I learned French in Senegal, but then I quickly forgot that, and I took up Arabic when I was in Cairo. And I became pretty proficient at it. I wouldn't say fluent, but able to speak it and certainly to get around.
Street language?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so did that, when you went into the service, did that prove of use to you? Or?
Absolutely it did. I mean, although Iraqi Arabic was very different from Cairo Arabic, it helped me to transition, so I acted sort of like an informal interpreter for my fellows and the Iraqis.
When did you decide, or why did you decide to go to the service?
You know, ironically, I enlisted in the service on the morning of September 11th, just before that. You
decided prior to that?
Yeah, I had decided. I'd gone through the process, mostly because I was feeling sort of out of place at college. I wasn't,
why was that?
I felt like I was stagnant, and I felt like I wasn't really living up to my potential, and I felt maybe I needed a change of scene to kind of kickstart me and get me sort of re-engaged with school. And so I decided to enlist in the reserve, which at that time wasn't necessarily a huge commitment prior to September 11th. Then after that, it
Army Reserve, or?
Yes, it was the Army Reserve.
Was this in the? It wasn't part of the college?
No. I enlisted in the Army
like the
Reserve.
ROTC or something?
No. I had to leave the college to attend.
Did you have any particular philosophical bent at that time?
You know, when I enlisted in the Army, I really didn't. I was sort of an unthinking. I was a kid. After I enlisted in the Army, I began to get very serious into Buddhism. I had studied Buddhism at school, but now with the impending stress of joining the military, I really began to knuckle under and study that and really get serious about what I thought about it. And I began to call myself a Buddhist, and I began to feel that in fact I was a Buddhist. However, it was still something very intellectual for me. It was very separate from the majority of my life. It was the deployment and my experiences in the war that really sort of forged me and made me become a much more serious Buddhist.
Did it occur to you at that time that being in military service and being a Buddhist might be incompatible?
Absolutely. It was a feeling that began very quickly after I had become a Buddhist, but it wasn't a serious consideration for me until much later. It was something that grew and grew in force, until when I was in Iraq, I realized that it was incompatible, and there was no way that I could uphold both of those commitments.
Your Buddhist experience really became a factor in everything you've come up with.
Absolutely. I think it was sort of the basis of my objection to the war.
When 9/11 hit, how did you feel about that, with this Buddhist inclination or feeling that you had, or the whole nature of man's relationship one to the other, and cultures clashing and that sort of thing?
Well, you know, initially when September 11th first happened, I think I, along with the majority of the American people, felt sort of swept up in this wave of patriotism and good feeling and sort of brotherly connection among other Americans. And I was very proud of that, and I was pleased to see that happening in the country. I thought it was wonderful. However, I began to get misgivings about it later on when I saw For example, they defaced a mosque here in Tampa shortly after September 11th, and there were sporadic incidents of other sort of anti-Islamic violence. And then all those feelings began to change, and they began to be turned outwards, and they became, instead of solidarity and concern for the victims, it became more of hatred and anger against Muslims and finger pointing, and those feelings really began to change, and ultimately I think they were channeled into creating the Iraq War and everything we have today.
In World War II, the Americans became very worried about both the Germans and the Japanese because they were in the Axis allies, and the Japanese attacked this country, and we went so far as to arrest all the Japanese and corralled them in what we don't call concentration camps, but they were essentially that.
Internment camps.
Internment. The people were treated humanely, but they lost their possessions, they lost their properties, and all that sort of thing. That outlook has always been a problem in this country. And that war, it was a draft. It was enforced, and everybody paid a tax in the form of rationing and that sort of thing. How did that kind of thinking did that cross your mind in terms of the American public and what they sacrifice or don't sacrifice versus the military doing the only sacrificing? I mean, this is a real conflict, I think, in our country.
No, you know, I mean, it's something that I've thought about, and I think a lot of soldiers are getting at in their own way. There's this feeling, especially for a returning soldier, that the society at large here in America is very disconnected from what's going on in Iraq. And there's a lot of lip service of support the troops and bumper stickers and so forth. But I don't think Americans at home feel the pinch, if you will, of the war. And so their life has been able to continue pretty much as normal. And so maybe they don't feel a strong connection or a strong sense of ownership about what's going on in Iraq, because there isn't the rationing, there isn't a draft, there isn't any sort of civil repercussion of us being at war. And so I think a lot of them mentally sort of distance the soldiers and the military from their normal life, and it's those people over there doing that thing.
Of course, the tax cuts we got tax cuts instead of tax increases, and we got spend more instead of rationing anything. And now we've got the gas prices and so forth going up, and people are bothered by that because they're pinched by that. So that kind of goes along with that. But with all of that, how did the Buddhism come into play when when did you become an MP?
Actually, I'm not an MP. I was trained as a vehicle mechanic, but I was assigned to a military police unit.
Oh.
So I was in a military police unit, but I myself was not a military policeman.
You were a mechanic, but
yes.
You were positioned to be at Abu Ghraib at one point.
I was, yeah. I was with a military police unit whose duties included holding prison camps and going on patrol. And so I went along with them on everything that they did.
Now, the pictures I saw at Abu Ghraib were not what I had expected to see that you'd shown, which were tents and outside facilities, and not very clean facilities for prisoners.
No, absolutely. I mean, it was shocking and sort of abhorrent to me to have this impression of what the military was and American professionalism and soldiers' ethics, and then at Abu Ghraib, for example, to witness the prisoners crowded densely into these tents, 50 or 70 men in a tent, and these sort of pools of filth and the trench latrines and just the mud and the razor wire.
So this looked like Caracas or someplace like that?
Yeah, I mean, it didn't look like anything that you would think of as American. It looked totally sort of unprofessional and extremely inhumane.
I'd seen concentration camps from World War II. We called them detention centers or something else, internment centers, where the German prisoners were held in Rockford, Illinois, and other places. And they were not living in tents. They were living in barracks and that sort of thing. And so the housing of these people was in open tents, basically.
Yeah.
How does that square with the photographs people have seen of Abu Ghraib and the inside prisons and the horrible abuses that were shown in the public?
Well, most of the main, the iconic abuse from Abu Ghraib that everyone saw on CNN happened in a specific part of Abu Ghraib called the hard site, where prisoners who were of intelligence value, so-called, were kept. Maybe 100 or 150 out of the 4,000 or 6,000
You had 4,000
prisoners.
to 6,000 overall, and then 100 or so were in this
and they were
hard site.
isolated.
Now, the hard site was
It was a prison block. I mean, they were living in prison cells with metal bars and so forth. The majority of American soldiers were also living in prison cells with metal bars and stuff. And the Iraqi prisoners were generally housed outside. So what it was one isolated unit of Abu Ghraib where the prisoners were held indoors, but the majority of prisoners were actually outside.
Now, was that air conditioned?
Oh, no, I don't imagine so.
But were you in that block at all?
No, I was